Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about one of my main men, Jenkins, a really popular and fun open source CI/CD tool. Before we get started on him, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Um, so yeah, Zoom did not like this particular graphic, so we're just going to tolerate it anyway because Zoom. Um, yeah, so I am Valarie Regas. I've kind of a non-traditional entryway into tech, but I'm here now, and that's all I care about. I'm married to my very best friend, and we have three precious babies. Um, I love speaking at events. I love the community, and my only regret, as far as conferences go right now, is that I can't see your beautiful faces and enjoy laughing with you. I have done judo for 24 years now. So I'll make random judo references and comments and just, accept it. It's part of me. And also, I have the best sisters in the whole world. I wish they were not pixelated, but alas, there is nothing I can do about that right this minute. So, moving on, let's talk about automation in general for a second. Now, this should pretty much go without saying, but just in case, I was once a young bootcamp graduate who didn't even know that that word existed until, right before I graduated. So let's talk about it. We automate anything that we can because it saves developer time and it adds to consistency, uniformity, and consistent best practices. What can we update? Well, today we're specifically going to be talking about, automating our build, package, test, deploy cycle, right? But really, thanks to the sexy goodness that is Bash scripting and Python, you can pretty much script anything to be automated. However, today we're going to stick to one thing. We're going to talk about Jenkins. Now, a lot of people assume that I talk about Jenkins because it's the best CI/CD tool, and I am going to say point blank, it is not. First of all, there's no such thing as the best tool. There is only the best tool for a given problem. Um, Second of all, I've been in this industry for coming up on 3 years, and Jenkins, both open source and enterprise, I've used, but that's the only main, pipeline automating CI/CD tool I have used. So why Jenkins? Well, that's what I know. However, I will say it's a great tool. I hear a lot of people say things like, "Oh, this other one has this capability and this," but I look at Jenkins and I would rather have a tool, personally, that maybe lacks a tiny amount of features that something shiny and new might have. However, if the existing tool has awesome documentation and a thriving community, I'd rather have that tool than something that could potentially be better. But when I invariably need to go to the docs, they're not that great and the community is not really there to talk about it. So that's, kind of my rundown on why Jenkins. It's not the best. It's definitely not the worst. It's great. It's the right tool for the problem that I have, which is I wanted to write a talk about automation. So let's just jump into this. So we're gonna use some phrases, and I want to, just clarify when I say them what I'm talking about, because sometimes I feel like, especially the two CDs get a little bit mixed up. So the whole point of automating your build pipeline, the whole point of the process I'm about to walk you through, is to achieve CI/CD. And by CI/CD, I'm referring to the continuous integration and delivery. Um, Continuous deployment, where every time you make a code change, it gets tested, and if that pass, it goes to production. I don't think I could sleep at night if I ever had to work on a real continuous deployment product. Obviously, continuous deployment sounds all well and good. Your test should be so good and your code should be so clean that it always pass tests and it going to prod doesn't bork anything. Well, guess what? You can't, for example, get users ready for a new feature because you're constantly deploying everything. I don't know, like people can debate it, but I'm going to stick to the top two. So when we talk about CI/CD, what we're really talking about is you as a developer. If you change some code, you fix a bug, you do whatever, and you add, commit, push to your branch, and merge that branch into your development branch, whatever it is. It's one, basically every time you make changes, not committing 50 times and then maybe once a week pushing changes. It's about merging in clean changes. One of the things with CI is you have to have tests. You have to have so many tests. And I'll show you some examples of, when tests don't pass later on. But I mean, for you to consistently being able to merge to whatever your primary development branch is, for example, that's a big deal. And the biggest way you achieve that, other than automating some things and working with your version control source, um, is by making the smallest increments of change possible, right? So if you are making 5 or 6 changes between pushes, well, if you break the build, who knows why? You're going to have to dig. But if you literally, I updated this, stop, commit, push, that makes it a lot easier to achieve this consistently being able to integrate your branch code into your primary development branch. Continuous delivery. This is kind of, this is my sweet spot. This is what I think is, the goal. It's not necessarily that you're constantly deploying. It's that you could. It's that you get to a place where your testing is so thorough, it's automated. Builds that don't pass your test just simply do not run. Code does not get deployed anywhere unless it passed testing, putting you in a spot where maybe you build as part of your pipeline. Okay, if it's any branch other than master, we're gonna blah 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 blah. We're gonna do these things. We're gonna test, and then we're gonna deploy to our dev or our qual or your integration environment, whichever stage you're on. But we're just gonna stop shy of production. We're just gonna stop there. But if I wanted to, everything that gets to that point is so clean. If I wanted to, I could click now deploy to prod at like 4:45 on a Friday evening and probably enjoy my weekend. That's really the goal, is to be able to deploy it on a moment's notice. Not necessarily that you want to. Maybe you want to hold back a couple of features until you can, speak with certain users and do some demos and show them the upcoming change. It depends on your product. So we're going to talk a lot about these things, and I just wanted to clarify what I'm talking about because there's not always agreement, especially on the CD part. All right, so let's talk about installing. This is one option. I'm doing this method mostly so that because I'm selfish, as it turns out, and I'm thinking about the bootcamp grads who are just kind of getting into this world, and I want to give them not just the easiest way, but a really tangible, interactive way to use Jenkins. I will say, for those who don't want to put something on their machine for whatever reason, Jenkins does make available, publicly available Docker image on Docker Hub. And it is no big thing to just run a little Jenkins machine on yours and do everything in that virtual environment. But that's a class for another day. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier that I like about Jenkins is the documentation. The only negative thing I might say about the Jenkins documentation is sometimes it's redundant in that you can find answers to the same questions in multiple places. I vastly prefer having the answer given to me too many times from too many different endpoints than not being able to find it at all. So this is they have a getting started guide, and it's really simple. You're just going to download Jenkins. And then you're going to open up a terminal in the download directory. I definitely recommend downloading their latest stable version because it's notoriously stable, as it turns out. But you got some options for what you want. Yeah, so once you've downloaded that, you're open up your terminal in the download directory. You can just run a simple command, and then you're gonna go to localhost, right? When you get there, it's going to ask you for the initial admin password. The only kind of horror story I have heard from people about this method of installing and using Jenkins is every now and then people can't find their initial admin password in the location specified. Like that is not where mine was. I ended up in a rather tedious fashion going through in the terminal with a little LSLA action and finding it. It took, enough work that I was irritated, um, but that it doesn't seem to be a common thing. So I will say, if it tells you where your initial admin password should be and it's not there, Stack Overflow. Yeah, that's my life since COVID. Just Slack Overflow. No, Stack Overflow is a really useful resource on this particular problem, I will say. But yeah, once you set up that or give it that initial admin password, it has you create your own, and then voila, you get to create some projects. Forgive me as we go through some of these images. Um, some of them are redacted, even though there's literally nothing in them of interest. Just ignore the gray boxes. They're completely useless, but whatever. I swear there's nothing intriguing or sexy underneath. um, from your shiny new dashboard, right? Once you have some projects created, you'll be able to see, and Jenkins uses the weather, right? So those sunshiny ones, they have a history of stable builds. The more lightning and thunder you get, the more you're sad about life. You can also see over on the on this whole, sort of side menu, you can see the phrase open blue ocean. I'm going to address this real fast. So all of these images are from the standard Jenkins GUI, right? It's not hot, guys. It is not, it's nothing to write home about. It's not, I mean, it is what it is. If you click open blue ocean, I think you have to have a plugin for that, and we'll address plugins later. But if you want to use a prettier UI, Blue Ocean is there. I can tell you, I have issues with it. One, as a dyslexic person, it's a lot of white writing on very bright colored squares. It's very hard for me to see. I know that if I were colorblind, there are way too many times where red and green are used next to each other, and that would be frustrating. The Blue Ocean dashboard, in the interest of pretty, I think sometimes is a little bit more difficult to find, especially like the output of a build or the logs of a build. And they're not, I don't know, it's just not for me. But I know that like our front end people, I think, prefer it. Maybe it's because it's pretty, and I'm more utilitarian. Um, and I was never really taught to girl. So I don't know, like, I don't know what it is about me other than with the dyslexia, the white writing really irritates me, but I think it's totally worth checking out to see which one suits your style. But just so you know, there is another GUI option. And everything we're doing today can be done through the command line. I just feel like that's really boring in a conference talk. So let's say we want to create a project. We want to link something to code. So we're going to give it a name. And there are lots of options for setting this up. I am going to show you how to do a multi-branch pipeline because it's the thing that I use the most. I think it's super utilitarian. However, the freestyle project is very popular. It's great, but there's a lot of documentation on it. And I find multi-branch is like Bacardi and cola, man. It gets the job done in a really easy way. So that's what we're going to talk about. So yeah, we're going to configure this. It wants to know a bunch of stuff about your project. So cool, we're going to name it. These two things are important. So you need to have a source for your code because it's going to interact with your version control. And you need to tell it how to know what to execute. And in a minute, we're going to discuss creating a Jenkins file, which is just basically a list of instructions. Now, you've got options. So let's say you have a project where you're really only deploying one, application within this repository. Then this root level Jenkins file that the arrow is showing, that's great. Just create one Jenkins file, throw it in the root directory, you're good. However, you might have repositories where you have 2 or 3 different actual applications deploying, and especially if they deploy in very different ways, you've got a couple of options. I am going to show you an example later of a mono repo deployment of multiple projects configured one way, but another option, especially if it would be hard to parameterize the deployment because the 2 or 3 things that you're deploying have very different requirements. And you don't want a Jenkins file that's 500 lines long, because it's really hard to parse through and figure out what's going on. One other option is to create multiple projects and they can still have under this GitHub, repository link. They can have the same overarching repository, but you specify if it's this particular folder, you are going to go find, if you've got like project A in this mono repo here, even though you're going to the mono repo with your code or with the link that you're going to share to your GitHub or whatever you end up choosing, you're just going to go to here and modify the script path to project1/Jenkins file. And that takes care of that. That does mean that you have to create multiple sets of instructions, right? So there's a lot to be said for if you can keep it smaller, reusable, great. But there are times where you might have things that just they're so they're deploying to completely different places that are hard to parameterize, whatever. But you should know that is an option, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more. Right. So linking GitHub, you've got to create some credentials. They do not ask for your name and password, mercifully. It's really simple. You're just going to go to developer settings under your personal settings. You're going to go to personal access tokens, create a new token. There is a lot of documentation around what permissions you need to give this particular access token. I'm not going to go over that right now because it's super easy to find, but yeah, make sure that you get your access token and go back and create that credential. Now, I am a crazy paranoid person. I always have been. I think about things that can go wrong. So I tend to save access tokens that are important to me in like a vault. Not like a vault in my basement where like the guns and cash are kept, but like password vault. But yeah, so in theory, Jenkins will associate this credential with this account until you delete it. So not a lot of pressure there. And then you just want to plug in the URL to the root directory of your code base. We're going to ignore the rest of the setup because by and large, default settings are great for this, especially with the multi-branch. By and large, you don't really have to do anything else. So you've clicked OK, you've saved. Let's talk about how we use Jenkins. So the Jenkins file, I kind of mentioned this earlier. There are 2 languages in which you can write a Jenkins file. I am going to show you examples of both. So right now we're looking at declarative pipeline. Declarative pipeline was invented by CloudBees to be an easier to read, easier to access version of the Jenkins file, which is, technically the scripted pipeline is like Groovy. And there's like quirky differences between True Groovy and Jenkins, but whatever. But yeah, the declarative pipeline is considered more readable and easier to get started with. So I'm going to kind of walk you through step by step what's going on here. So pipeline is how you define a pipeline. It's how Jenkins knows that you're starting the pipeline. Agent any. An agent is just a machine that does work. And if you don't have really intense specifications of, I want you to run on my particular node with this label, blah, blah, blah. Just when you're getting started with your personal projects, you can get to that later. Then you've got your stages that you have to define. So the 3 basic stages that should always always exist are going to be build, test, and deploy. You could have 17 stages depending on what you're writing and the needs of your application. But in general, you got to build it. You should always test it, and then you deploy it. Within each stage, you can define steps. Steps are cool because you can choose, like, say you have a couple of steps that need to happen during testing, and you have several different testing frameworks that you have tests written for whatever reason. And they have different needs, right? They need different utilities. They have different dependencies. You can absolutely make a step where you run that step inside of a Docker container, and it has all the utilities that Selenium needs, or Cypress, or any other testing framework you use, right? But maybe you have a third one that requires Python and pip and things that are different. Well, guess what? You can just do another step run it in a different Docker container that you can absolutely pull from a publicly available Docker image from Docker Hub. And it leads to a lot of flexibility, because then you're not worried about what utilities the agent has. You just get to do your work, right? You just spin up your burner machine, do some stuff, and then spin it on down. Spin on down the road. So that's declarative pipeline. So I'm showing you an example of scripted pipeline, but they have the same capabilities and functionality. Like there's really not a huge difference in my mind. It is the only difference for me is which documentation I go to check my syntax. That's it. One of the things I like about Jenkins is you can talk about if it's a certain branch, if it's not a certain branch. The behavior can be very different. That makes it really convenient. For example, if you are working on a branch that's going to be kind of a big change, you can just go ahead and look, hey, Jenkins, look, if it's this particular branch, do some stuff that you don't normally do. And that way I don't have to merge that code in until I'm really ready. And you can exclude branches in the same way. So like right now we're saying if it's anything other than the master branch, just go do these things. I do want to point out another thing that's really cool about Jenkins is just like most any other tool, you can create, functions that make things repeatable. So this is an example of a mono repo where there were several projects to be deployed, and their deployment process was pretty much the same. It was pretty much, npm run build, and then, we're going to put it in a Docker container. We're going to put it on the cloud, and everything was the same. All of the credentials and keys and, the shell commands, they were all the same. And so it was easy to just say, okay, we're going to define a build step, right? We're going to pass through our environment and the app name. And then inside a container, now node is a container based on node Docker image. So now we know that node is installed in that particular container, and we're just going to run a shell script, npm run build app environment. The thing to look out for in this particular circumstance was that, the front end devs needed to make sure that build scripts matched this convention if you're doing custom things. But doing things like this where you're not writing out, the same commands again and again and again really helps. And Jenkins is really flexible with custom functions. They don't have so many reserved words that it makes it hard for you. It makes it quite simple, I think. So what happens? So the whole point of Jenkins and connecting our GitHub is we now have established webhooks. And we're going to invoke those on, I guess, line 4, right? So let's say you've worked on this, you made a change, and you add, commit, push. All right, and you push to your working branch that you're working on. So Jenkins is going to, via webhooks, connect with GitHub and look for changes, right? So it recognizes that there has been a change on a branch. And now it's going to go down its list of instructions. And so does this satisfy if it's anything other than master branch? Yep. So we're going to go forward. We're going to do this work in a custom labeled node. But then this first step, this try, the checkout SCM is where it really connects with GitHub and looks for actual changes. And it's a really important step. And then it starts doing its work. So we've got our stage, build dev, right? The first thing, and so parallel is kind of a thing I had not heard of until this particular thing necessitated it. But it basically just means that even though we're only defining one container a few lines down, this node containing container, parallel means it's going to go ahead and spin up a container for every command we give it at the bottom. So for this npm install stage, we're telling it for each of these things down at the bottom, we're going to spin up this container that has node in it and run npm install. And it's going to evoke this custom function that we built, build step, and we've given it all the parameters and we've given it some labels. Now, why give it labels? Because remember back when we were at the GUI back then, and that side menu had all those things? Once you are inside a project, you can click on the phrase console output. And in real time, while the build's happening, get feedback on what's happening. So, for example, this is where, and it, You can disable it if you would rather just get all the input at the end. But if you want to watch the console output, you can see it's saying, all right, here we are. Pipeline, we're at stage build dev in parallel. We're going to do this thing. We're spinning up this container and we're going to npm install. And then as it keeps going, after those npm packages were installed, all right, container parallel. And it's processing what all jobs does it want me to do in parallel. And then it spins up containers for each. And then, okay, it recognizes we're going to npm run build catalog dev. And you can see that happening. What's really nice about the way console output is done with Jenkins, I feel, is because it is so thorough about making sure that you know exactly where you are in the pipeline you've defined. It's very easy to see when things went wrong and to figure out at exactly what point in the process did communication breakdown, was a package not found, was a dependency not installed. Like it's really easy. And a big pet peeve of mine is like a vague error message. Very rarely, very rarely do I get an error message that I either don't immediately recognize or it's super Google friendly. It's just their error reporting is, I find, fairly verbally specific, and thank you for that. Okay, so back over on the GitHub GUI, you've now, pushed some changes to your feature branch, and you're going to merge that into the main development branch. Well, while that's happening, Jenkins is still communicating with GitHub and it's running some checks. And it really doesn't want you to merge anything until those checks have completed and passed. And so some different things can happen. I've never actually seen a merge with caution. I only ever see, green or red. But yeah, so either your checks will pass or they won't. I assume that if they don't pass, you're going to want to know why. You click on the word details next to it. It takes you to the GUI, to the console output, and shows you exactly what chunk went wrong. So it's really good about helping you debug so that you can get to that green place where, your code reviewers have now reviewed you, because we should always do that. All the checks have passed and this is ready to go. It's ready to go. It means that when you finally merge that pull request, you have just another layer of certainty that you've done your job well and it's ready to be deployed. Another cool thing, and I have never actually put any like notifications in separate files, but I really liked this example because it shows you different ways to do this for email, HipChat, and Slack. If you don't need all three of those, this is a lot of code to just have. If you only want Slack notifications, it's real simple. And you literally just define this notify build, these are reserved functions. There's a Slack plugin. So you don't, or reserve variables. So it's not like you have to define job name somewhere. Jenkins will just pull that. And then at the end of whatever stage you're doing, you just notify build and either deploy it or didn't. And that way you define a Slack channel, tell it where to go, and it just does. It's really nice. It's a great way to keep track of your builds. And especially if you need to communicate with other people, you can, underneath that success or failure message, just in a thread, and it keeps, your Slack from getting really super messy and noisy. So just another really cool random functionality. You can have it email you, whatever. So we talked about a couple of plugins. The plugin options for Jenkins is nigh limitless. Some things are nice to haves and some things are sort of necessary. Like if you are using GKE, you really need, there's a certain number of plugins that are just, without them, it doesn't work as well. But for the most part, just browse, look around, because it can do some cool stuff that I probably don't even know about because there's too many to really know all of the plugin options. But I would encourage you, once you feel comfortable just connecting your code to Jenkins and deploying it via Jenkins, absolutely see if you can make it better. See if you can make it easier to read by a certain plugin that takes care of defining some things for you. The plugins are great. I highly recommend them. Okay, so final thoughts. I think that with most pieces of software, there's too much to know to ever really know that piece of software. Having said that, I feel like Jenkins' strongest suit is that while there's so much more I could know, it is intuitive enough to use really quickly. I would love it if at some point, if you do your first project, especially if like, this isn't your normal thing, you're typically doing something completely different and you stepped outside of your comfort zone. I would love if you shared the GitHub link with me. I am on Twitter and I have a website and I'm on LinkedIn and I always um, support people connecting because as it turns out, the community is the whole reason to do this. The people, you watching are the whole reason to record this and deal with writing things. And the knowledge that you give me and hopefully that I give you is amazing. And so thank you so much for joining me and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.